So this presentation examines legal, economic, and political transactions in Granada, where frameworks of commensurability between Christians and Muslims were invoked or revoked at the turn of the 16th century. And I'll be focusing mainly on interreligious property transactions following the War of Granada, 1482 to 1492, and the contracts of conquest, as I call them, that were enacted upon the Mudéjar and then who became Morisco subjects, between 1499 and 1502. All of which sets the stage, I argue, for the early Morisco legislation, which is drawn up eventually in the 1510s, so actually a little bit beyond when we might expect to first see it emerge. And that's, I kind of want to look at the progression across these 2 decades. So as political and legal vocabularies changed in these crucial decades, so too did policies of assimilation or exclusion by Christian rulers toward their Muslim subjects, and particularly in Granada. This presentation traces these discursive changes across legal and political instruments that were operating in post-conquest Granada, which in theory made, I argue, social groups and legal regimes commensurate. This commensurability derived from the common fact of being subject to the same political settings, which determined access to legal resources. So I mean here that formerly Nasrid subjects became Castilian subjects by treaty, and then these treaties determined and sanctioned the legal resources to which those subjects had access. And then also legal transactions were funneled into new common institutions that were staffed by a kind of common hybrid set of personnel. So radical changes in discourse about commensurability, however, took place during these 2 decades, and I argue eventually generated a politics of inequality and discrimination, which was all too often expressed through individual and collective violence, and eventually will generate various periods of expulsion. Okay, so we've talked a lot about legal pluralism today. We haven't really talked about legal pluralism, but we've seen examples of legal pluralism. And so what I want to suggest today is that in the Granada Mudéjar case, very specifically, we see a shift from legal pluralism to what I'm calling legal commensurability. This happens because the primary legal and political instruments of conquest were, of course, the surrender treaties. And beyond the surrender treaties, the subsequent range of scribal, legal, and documentary practices which underpinned the enforcement of those treaties. In the case of Granada, most surrender treaties, on the model of other Mudéjar treaties earlier, articulated a regime of legal pluralism that was analogous to other Mudéjar communities in Castile and Aragon. And so we have had a number of really brilliant elucidations of how these cases looked in very different contexts over time, especially Brian and Teo's brilliant illustrations of these frameworks, how they actually operated in practice. Just to give some examples to illustrate how these post-conquest institutions in Mudéjar Granada continue to accommodate Nasrid era practices. We see here, just for example, this is, we've got one example here of how we see that the inheritance, actually to go back to the family law comparison, the inheritance taxes are going to be maintained, in the way that they had been in Nasrid Granada, but those, of course, the taxes are then being funneled into the common treasury. And then the second example here, it's a case that I find particularly suggestive. These are the minutes from the first extant minutes from the Granada Cabildo, date from 1497, even though the Cabildo is operating before 1497. And what we see is that they are changing the scheduling of the Cabildo meetings not to accommodate the Muslim councilmen who don't want to come on Fridays. So of course, this tells us that there had been and now there were not Muslim councilmen who are, who may or may not have wanted to come on Fridays. So the short-lived period of Mudéjar Granada, which lasts only from 1492 to 1499, we see these practices of legal pluralism are replaced by a framework that I refer to as legal commensurability, which is especially fueled by particular translation practices and strategies that made probative value legible across Islamic and Christian legal systems. Commensurability in this case derived from the common setting of the Castilian law courts, where both Islamic and Christian notarial practices and scribal practices intersected, and indeed are even performed by the same people. So this is a really interesting document, and it's also the cover of my recent book. But this refers to the kind of sanctioning of a property transaction from the late 1490s, and this is itself not the property transaction. but it is a note in Arabic by a former al-Faqih, so kind of a former leading jurist in the Nasrid system who had converted, and he is explaining why the property transaction was valid under Islamic law. And then we see this, being translated then into, this is not the translation either. Neither of these are the translations. They're just the kind of scribal tags that assert that the translations, which are also in the Legajo, are legitimate. And in both of these cases, we have two scribes. Actually, the Arabic scribe is also a member of the town council, who are members of Mudechar families who had recently converted. Okay, great. And this guy here, Sharafi, right here we can see it. Sharafi, we've got a couple examples from him here, and also his father. So the process becomes really evident in property transactions that were effected after the conquest of Granada in 1492, which sales by Mudéjares to Christians or to other Muslims were registered in new Spanish institutions, so especially in the town council archives. These transactions required translations of documents or transactions that had been effected under Nasrid legal structures. And we see many of the renacimientos that were generated in this first generation after 1492. They're the records of sales or other transfers during this period that were based on earlier transactions before 1492. Over and over again in this period of translation, these first 2 decades, we see constantly this claim that the legal value of the document or the knowledge about the transaction has been sanctioned by the way it was done in Tiempo de Moros. And so here, I've just got, a couple of examples. This is the same scribe who we just saw his hand in the previous slide. It uses exactly the same formula in these 2 documents. This is his father. I find this document actually even more suggestive. Possibly before he had even converted, he is present at a transaction, an Arabic-only transaction in 1498, but then it's translated in 1503. And so not only is he able to translate it, but he talks about the way that he participated in that transaction in 1498 as an al-Faqih, who then became a scribal notary in the Castilian system after he converted. Okay. So not only linguistic translation was required, however, to create legal commensurability. And as I've shown with these examples, we have a whole coterie of legal and scribal personnel who had been trained and really forged during the diplomatic and other negotiations of the war and the Mudéjar period, who become the bilingual corps of officials that are supporting the Castilian administration in Granada, certainly during the Mudéjar period and then also in the Morisco period. These essential scribal and archival practices enabled legal commensurability. Translation was, of course, a key practice in this configuration, and it was a mechanism by which these Spanish translators transported the value of Nasrid transactions with some version of this phrase, según la sharia, la sunna de los moros. So what I'm arguing here is that legal commensurability governs this translation according to the norms of the Nasrid system into Spanish, according to the norms of the Castilian system. And this synthesis guaranteed certain continuities. But paradoxically, it would eventually promote a gradual distancing between, on the one hand, the nominal legal status of the group who is, whatever group is doing, participating in the petitioning, and the perception of the Mudéjar subjects vis-a-vis other subjects of the Castilian crown. So it's important to note, of course, that this distancing is not necessarily a given. The contractual language that we would expect from the surrender treaties is one of parity, right? We've seen this in lots and lots of the surrender treaties. I just put up some of the kind of most familiar language for you guys. But then, as Isabella would say, we're taking these Mudéjares as our vassals and our natural subjects under our royal protection, favor, and defense. I mean, we see this in many of the treaties, the surrender treaties. It's important to notice the kind of characterization of this natural relationship between the sovereign and his subjects, which is going to disappear when we get to the contracts of conversion. So it's in these first contracts, but not in the second contracts. Now, I had put this slide together as about fiscal pluralism, but thinking about Teo's talk yesterday, especially, I'm starting to think that a good way of thinking about this could also be fiscal violence, which is what Teo invoked. So we see that in the new institutions which organize the legal and fiscal activities of daily life, now in these Castilian frameworks, pre-conquest habits will condition relations between Castilian rulers and Mudéjar subjects. For example, in the original treaties, which guaranteed there would be no obligation to convert and mandated that both legal regimes would be valid, there was also the promise that the new subjects would pay no more tax than they had been able to accustomed to paying under Nasrid rule. So this promise meant in practice, however, that the Granada Mudéjares become a group that is fiscally as well as legally distinct from other subjects of Granada. So the upshot is we have in the Mudéjar period vassals like any other natural vassals who are fiscally and legally distinct. This is a familiar story, but this is actually a story that is going to endure into the Morisco period, and we want to understand how. I'm just looking at the time. I still have plenty of time, but I also know how much more I have to tell you, so I think I'm going to just jump ahead. I think this point is clear. Okay. So this is just an illustration of kind of the enduring use of Nasrid era documents and their transposition into the Castilian scheme. So as I have said, the commensurability derived from the site and personnel who process those transactions. Any conflict that might arise over such transactions was processed by the Royal Appellate Court in Granada, and this is where a lot of the documents about this come from, and various legal events, either property transfer, conflict over property claims, etc., are going to be translated into Christian institutions by the same kind of staff that I had just mentioned. It does have an enduring effect on the Castilian legal landscape, even though I'm arguing that the period of legal commensurability is actually quite short. There is an enduring effect. And so this particular lawsuit, which actually dates from the 12th century, and some of you have heard me talk about it before, it's going to endure into the 18th century. And here we have some documentation, which is still making the argument that there is some commensurability about these documents. As you guys can see here, all of these documents and the records of possession, wills, etc., they maintain their force and their form in the same way during Tiempo de Moros, no conforme a sus leyes. Okay, so how then do we get from the Mudéjar period to the absence of legal commensurability, which certainly begins to obtain after the 1520s, I would argue. And just as a reminder, we see that legal commensurability is gone by the 1560s. This is a famous document by Francisco Núñez Boulay, in which he laments, amongst many other things, the pejorative treatment of Granada's Moriscos, but especially the fact that sanctions are being made against the use of Arabic language legal documentation. And here we can see in the English translation, he's complaining they won't be able to rely on the original legal code, the Jus Antigua, anymore. So this is, as this audience knows very well, his pro-Arabic and pro-Morisco arguments are based on the idea that the Arabic language has no relationship with the Muslim faith, right? So he's not going to talk about the Sharia and the Sunnah, right? The Sharia Sunnah. He's going to use a different concept. This is kind of a rhetorical move, which I think is actually quite in line with his arguments about the Arabic language. Both the Arabic language and legal documentation in Granada were legitimate because they were autochthonous, not because they were Islamic or Christian. So what happened then between the 1490s and the 1560s? Well, we know a number of things that happened. We know about the first rebellion of Bukhara, which has already been mentioned. But one, in terms of the legal discourse, an important set of documents that emerged are these conversion contracts, which are locally issued all across Granada during the period of 1500 to 1502. So during this period, the Catholic kings drew up a series of capitulations which defined a new political, legal, and fiscal regime for their subjects who had been recently converted. And so here is where I argue that we have a new distinct community of conquered Christian subjects. And it's because of the creation of this new and legally defined entity of Christian subjects that is made possible the subsequent legislation, which is eventually going to strengthen the ideologies of cultural difference. So that is these nuevamente convertidos that come to being in the discursive space of the 1500 to 1502 contracts were a different kind of Christian than the Christian Castilian subjects who also lived in Granada. And this means also, of course, we are moving away from the model of the Mudéjar contract. One thing that these contracts did in 1500 to 1502 is that they erased the fiscal pluralism of the Mudéjar period, yet creating a new political category. So that means that the idea that these communities had to pay special taxes or that they would be subject to the Nasrid regime rather than the Castilian regime is revoked. Now these communities are going to pay the same taxes as any other Christian subject in Granada. Nevertheless, you won't be surprised to learn, despite the letter of the law, we have an enduring fiscal pluralism that lasts well into the Morisco period. And so how does this come about? Just very briefly, as you guys know, or many of you may know, the conversion contract draws from two other types of legal and fiscal instruments that are also concerned with the organization of land, jurisdiction, and population, and so of course also with taxation, and one of our great themes. These instruments are the establishment of parishes and also the repartimientos. So we know how the repartimiento worked through the later Middle Ages as during the period of Christian conquest, including then during the conquest of Granada. Also, on the other hand, though, we have as early as 1486 a papal bull granting Ferdinand and Isabel the right to erect churches and monasteries in Granada, not only for new settlers, which was the primary goal, but also for the goal of evangelization and conversion. So this is just a quick illustration of the kind of difference that we see between the surrender treaties and the conversion contracts, right? So we have those protections that we are familiar with, and then we have this nominal fiscal and legal equality, which of course is in theory rather than in practice. So in terms of the ecclesiastical organization, even when the war was far from over and there was no official position about the conversion of the Mudéjar populations, we have this kind of contradictory tension between the new non-Christian subjects who will become Christian subjects, this contractual relationship between subject and sovereign based on political toleration and legal pluralism, and on the other hand, the spatial politics of resettlement that is already starting to mark out religious boundaries across Granada. So together, the capitulations, the parish boundaries, and the repartimientos are reshaping the Kingdom of Granada as a collection of legally, and even after 1500, fiscally differentiated communities of Christian subjects of the crown. So as I said, the contracts of conversion stipulated that the differential tax system and its valuable revenue stream should have become obsolete. The new subjects no longer owed Mudéjar taxes, derechos moriscos, but only the diezmo or bayala of the Christians. Nevertheless, as early as 1503, just after the period of the conversion contracts, the Catholic kings began to require, once again, servicios extraordinarios, but exclusively from the newly converted populations, and these servicios extraordinarios would become servicios ordinarios relatively quickly. So there's a set of royal edicts that are promulgated concerning the special taxation nominally for both Moriscos and for Old Christians, one that you may be familiar with, the Farda de la Mar. And from the name Farda, we can also intuit that there had been some practice of taxing communities that lived along the coasts, even in the Nasrid period. Now, before 1501 in the conversion contracts, this farda had been assessed to gather funds specifically for the defense of coasts. It was in theory collected from the Old Christians as well as from new Christians, especially those living around the Malaga and the Las Malaga regions. After 1501, the obligation was extended to the entire Kingdom of Granada. Old Christians are not exempt. But at the same time that the new tax regime is promulgated, the Catholic kings granted all kinds of local franquicias or exemptions to majority Old Christian settlements, effectively putting the burden of this tax exclusively on the new Christian population. So we are familiar with the story, and we heard about it from Teo yesterday, that extraordinary taxes are used to fund what is becoming ordinary military operations of the crown, and also to address defensive needs of the newly Castilian coastline. How is the Crown going to organize the continuity of this taxation? Well, one way is to create a taxable difference and to legally demarcate fiscal obligations through a variety of instruments, which is what I think leads to the growing emphasis on making laws about cultural markers that emerge especially between 1511 and 1513. These laws about cultural markers were explicitly directed at the communities of nuevamente convertidos, so the new converts, who had already been identified in the conversion contracts as communities, Christian communities, upon whom extra taxation and sometimes also tribute, we can think of various examples, in exchange for the rights to certain cultural practices like speaking Arabic, extra taxation and extra tributes could be levied. The contracts of conversion, then drawn up between 1500 and 1502, delineated the new terms under which converts could live in Castilian territory. While they intended to bring the dual legal and fiscal system to an end, they almost immediately had the opposite effect. As Angel Galan Sanchez has referred to it, this arrangement was effectively a legal fiction by which all Christians are technically responsible for extraordinary taxes, but their names or properties were never recorded on the tax rolls. So we've seen by the time of the new Morisco legislation, the language of vassalage, the language of naturaleza has entirely disappeared. This is language that could have established special rights for the Moriscos, but instead creates provisions that justify special obligations for that population. And of course, this has drastic consequences in the following generations. In the new documentation, they are not referred to as vasallos anymore, but as either maybe vecinos or moradores, but not súbditos, not naturales. And of course, they are referred to constantly as nuevamente convertidos de moros and moras. So we have nuevamente convertidos who are still by definition moras y moras, but Christian moras y moras, thus brought into the Christian community as a distinct category. And this new category provided the basis for legal fictions of difference and ongoing fiscal violence against Moriscos. Thank you very much.